A mostly dry start, though there may be some patchy rain in the west for a time. Elsewhere, dry and cloudy with limited brightness. Mostly dry but cloudy throughout this afternoon, right across the whole country. Patchy rain in the far northwest will ease. And that is how the weather's shaping up for the rest of this Monday, the 24th of January. Hello there, I'm Eamonn.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamonn Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamonn.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 this Monday morning and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. I'll be bringing you all the latest politics, national insurance, COVID restrictions, Ukraine and yes, even some Tory leadership. But first, it's your morning headlines.
Good morning, it is 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright in the GB News newsroom. Let's get you up to date. The Prime Minister has asked the Cabinet to conduct an inquiry into allegations made by an MP that she lost her job because of her faith. Nusrat Ghani claims she was sacked as a junior minister because of concerns about her Muslimness. Ms Ghani's welcomed the investigation but stressed the inquiry must include all that was said in Downing Street and by the whip. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is braced for the publication of Sue Gray's report into allegations of Downing Street parties during lockdown. The findings of the investigation are expected to be released this week. The Foreign Office says that some British staff and dependents are being withdrawn from the embassy in Ukraine in response to the growing threat from Russia. Well, it comes after the US ordered the families of American staff at their embassy in Kiev to leave the country. Russia has over 100,000 troops at its border with Ukraine, but denies it claims it's planning an investigation. The Liverpool taxi bomber Eamonn al-Swilman's asylum's claim was rejected 6 years before his attack. Newly obtained court documents show the Iraqi-born 32-year-old also falsely claimed to be of Syrian heritage in his applications. Well, he died when his homemade bomb detonated in a taxi outside Liverpool Women's Hospital last November. Unions representing over 1 million NHS workers are calling for inflation-busting pay rises to stop growing exodus of exhausted staff. The government clashed with unions last year over NHS pay, eventually agreeing a 3% pay rise. The Alliance of British Drivers says changes to the highway code are dangerous, and then there's lack of a plan to notify road users. Cyclists are going to be encouraged to ride in the middle of the road, and drivers will have more responsibility to watch out for cyclists and pedestrians. Well, pending parliamentary approval, the new advice will come into effect this Saturday. You're up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. I'll be getting up to date across the day. Right now, the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Welcome to the briefing with Tom Harwood here on GB News. Well, this is the start of a momentous week. Sue Gray's long-awaited report may well finally be published, although as of this morning she had not even spoken to Dominic Cummings yet. There's a chance this could all drag on into next week, and perhaps that would be in Boris Johnson's favour, given everything else that's going on. Well, aside from arguing over parties, there's other news too. Tens of thousands more Russian troops are amassing on the Ukrainian border. Britain is evacuating non-essential embassy staff. And while the UK has undoubtedly led the world in its strong response to the threat, from training troops to supplying anti-tank missiles, other countries appear to be in the pocket of Putin. Germany in particular is paralysed in hock to Russia over gas supply. How ironic is it that some tried to claim it was Brexit Britain that was bending to Russia? And it's, on the contrary, it's the Germans. And today we learned that the Liverpool bomber lied about his identity, had his asylum claim comprehensively rejected years ago, and yet was able to stay in the country. In the last few months, an MP has been killed, a hospital almost bombed, and a terrorist exported to Texas. The terrorist threat must not be allowed to slip down the news agenda. Meanwhile, the cost of living crisis continues to pinch. Loose monetary policy over the last 2 years has undoubtedly sent inflation spiralling, now the highest it has been in a generation. People in their 20s and 30s have never known anything like it. Who would have thought that the government simply printing money has consequences for its value? Extraordinarily, as prices are rising too, so are taxes. A government that likes to boast of growth is on the precipice of slamming corporations and families with billions more in tax. By some measures, the highest tax burden in 70 years. What on earth will that do to growth? And the worst of Omicron looks to be behind us, but what are the chances of being thrown off course or simply spooked by another new variant along the line? The UK government looks like it absolutely made the right decision in England, while Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland suffered under unnecessary restrictions. Ironically, on COVID and indeed Ukraine, the UK government appears to be genuinely world-beating, just as internal squabbles may well be bringing it down. Well, we cannot sit around waiting for Sue Gray all week. On the briefing, of course, we'll be bringing you the latest on Graham Brady's letters, and I'll be keeping my ear pressed to the ground in Westminster, bringing you all the intrigue and fact-based reporting that I can. But we will not do that to the exclusion of the many other issues that continue to affect this country. Well, let's kick off with one of those issues, the cost of living. Former Brexit Secretary David Davis has called for the planned national insurance hike to be scrapped as a cost of living crisis looms. National insurance, which isn't insurance at all, by the way, in many ways it's simply another income tax with slightly better PR. After all, it goes into the same taxation pot. Well, this jobs tax, let's call it, is paid by both employees and employers, of course. Consequently, taxes upon both are scheduled to rise by 1.25% at the start of the new tax year in April, in a manifesto-breaking move to raise £12 billion, which is said to be going to the NHS. Well, joining us now to talk about this is Danny Boxall, Media Campaign Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to the programme. First of all, David Davis making this call today, will it have much sway with the government, do you think?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Tom. And, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned it's a 1.25% increase, but I think that masks how much of an impact that actually is going to have on people on the lowest incomes. And I know you're saying, like, David Davis has called for it. Well, on the front page of the Mail this morning, the whole cabinet is apparently calling for a delay in the national insurance increase. So hopefully, you know, this is going to actually have some sway on the Prime Minister, and he's actually going to stop this tax rise that's going to hit families in April when, you know, energy prices are rising, income tax has been frozen at its current level when, you know, incomes are rising. So a lot more people are going to be dragged into paying higher rates of income tax. Council tax is going up as well. And of course, not forgetting that the VAT cut on hospitality is also coming to an end. So we're seeing this whammy of tax hikes and the end of tax cuts as well coming in at the same time. And I think it's really going to have a horrible impact on people on the lowest incomes.
So 1.25% on people's earnings, but also 1.25% on employers, which might mean they choose to not raise people's wages by as much as they would. So in effect, 2.5% being taken away from people. What does that mean in terms of the cash in ordinary people's pockets?
Well, if you're on a salary of £20,000, that means that you're going to be paying an extra £130 a year in national insurance. So that is a lot of money that is going out of people's back pockets, you know, when they're facing other squeezes on their incomes at the same time. And you mentioned, yeah, this is a tax on employers as well. So it's going to make the cost of hiring more expensive. So we're going to have a sort of long-term impact of this where growth is going to be slowed down. We're going to see less employment. And, you know, people's wages are more likely to stagnate, which with a frozen income tax is going to be a sort of double whammy on people, you know, facing quite a difficult time coming out of the pandemic as well. You know, not forgetting that a lot of people's incomes were squeezed then as well. If they were on furlough, they saw their income reduced. So it's going to be really difficult over the long term. And I know Rishi Sunak has said that, you know, by the time of the next election that he wants to cut taxes. But I think it's going to be too little too late by then.
It's interesting looking at the politics of all of this. We've seen Operation Red Meat sort of stuttering into life last week, but also this being a government that's been pretty easy with taxing and spending. The Chancellor, the Prime Minister, and not too much opposition from the cabinet, albeit David Frost, Lord Frost, when he was there, saying that they were taxing too much, Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg as well. I wonder whether the political situation, the weakness of this Prime Minister this week, means it more or less likely that this pause, that this rethink could go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, the Operation Red Meat, we saw the first sort of example of it this last week, which was the BBC licence fee sort of freeze effectively. And, you know, whilst that does, it is good news for a lot of people. But I mean, the Prime Minister should be going one further and saying that we're going to scrap the licence fee because, you know, it is an outdated model. And I think that would actually help a lot of people that are struggling with their incomes at the moment and struggling with this cost of living crisis. But he hasn't really gone for the full thing that he could do. So I think that's, you know, really where the Prime Minister is falling down, is he's thinking about these things, but he's not actually going ahead with them to the full extent that he could be. And he's not really, you know, making some bold changes here that he sort of promised. You know, that in the manifesto, they said they were going to protect the incomes of low-income families. And low-income families already pay over 50% of their income in tax. So I really hope that he's going to do something to help them in, you know, the coming weeks and months.
There's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit there, not least not introducing new taxes, let alone going to get rid of some taxes. Well, Danny Boxall from the Taxpayers Alliance, thank you for running through that really important story, stuff that really hits ordinary people in their pockets. Well, moving on, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said that the impact of Scotland's COVID restrictions on businesses and hospitality have been worth it. From today, adults will again be able to meet up with more than 3 households as restrictions ease. Nightclubs are also opening. However, restrictions on face masks as well as the vaccine passport scheme will continue. Well, let's talk to John McTernan, political strategist and commentator. Welcome to the programme, John. First of all, England took a very different path from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland over Omicron. And now it looks like those other parts of the UK are sort of catching up with England. Did the Prime Minister's gamble pay off?
It's not clear to me that anybody should be talking about this as a gamble. Lots of lives have been lost over this last period due to Omicron. Many of them because people were unvaccinated, but those lives have been lost. And I think all the governments of the UK have been taking what they think are the appropriate risk assessments and moving forward on that. We had yesterday a senior figure from the World Health Organization saying that she is worried that some of the suggested lifting of restrictions in the UK are too early, and that the whole of 2022 will still be in the pandemic. And it's only in 2023 we can start thinking about living with COVID as being endemic. So, look, I think there's been a definite hit in the UK, across the UK, on hospitality. In England, it was because people voluntarily stopped going to pubs. In Scotland, it was because there were restrictions. The hit to the industry is the same, and the failure of government to support those industries is the same. And so, in that sense, the balance that was struck differently. But the way the UK government did it was a way to minimise the expenditure from the Treasury to support industries that were compulsorily shut down. So, look, we'll have to see over time. Scotland's got a slightly better, lower transmission rate, lower death rate, but we have to look at this thing in the round, and there is an inquiry, hasn't it, been launched by the UK government.
It's interesting looking at that stringency index over time, although the measures have been slightly different and maybe getting more different as the time went on. For the most part of the pandemic, when those real big spikes in deaths happened, the restrictions weren't all that different between the four nations of the United Kingdom. I would, however, say I heard that interview with the lady from the World Health Organization yesterday. It seemed to run up against something that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine was saying, in that the UK, or England at the very least, could be the first country in the Northern Hemisphere to leave the pandemic, to enter this endemic stage of COVID, sort of saying that we'll never have higher antibody levels than we do now, both with the incredible effect of the booster programme, but also Omicron having swept through this country. That there is a bit of a sense, is there not, that sort of, if not now, if not with this level of immunity in the population, then when? When could we remove the remaining restrictions?
The core question, which I think the WHO are raising, is it ever safe to say that if you're infected, you don't have to quarantine? Because if you're infected, you can pass it on to other people. That's the truth. And the other point that the WHO make, which Gordon Brown makes, which most world leaders make, is that until the world is safe, we're not safe. That people will still come into the UK, travel into the UK, carrying the new variants. We don't think Omicron is the final variant. And therefore, there needs to be caution during this year. Yes, we have to live with this new thing. This may not be the worst virus that we get. This may just be a test of our structures. And I think one of the concerns that I have globally is not just vaccinating the global south, but actually making sure that the next time we get a virus, because there will be a next time, that we're able to respond quickly and effectively, have the right support measures in place, and that we've all learned the new ways of working from home, traveling safely, social distancing, all of those things. I think people have done a great job, and we have to kind of take a slightly longer look at the figures. But I would be always slightly more cautious in letting people free to do what they want.
Well, it was 2 years ago yesterday that Wuhan entered its first form of regional lockdown. It's really interesting to look back over what we've learned over the last 2 years. The expert consensuses that were initially against masks, against travel bans, but are now the other way round. Hopefully we can learn some lessons from this pandemic. But for now, John McTernan, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Interesting to get your perspective there. Well, this week the Foreign Office has begun the process of withdrawing some British staff and dependents from the embassy in Ukraine in response to the growing threat from Russia. It comes after the US ordered families of American staff at their embassy to leave the country. Russia has over 100,000 troops at the Ukrainian border but denies claims it's planning an invasion. Well, Keir Giles is an expert in Russian power projection at Chatham House, a world-leading foreign policy think tank. Welcome to the programme. First of all, can we trust anything that Russia is saying at the moment?
It's a general rule that no, you probably shouldn't. In fact, among the Russia-watching community, there's a tag that goes, don't believe anything until the Kremlin denies it, because there's usually a consistent pattern that if something is happening in the world and you're not sure whether Russia is behind it, as soon as you get that official Kremlin denial, you can be fairly certain that actually, yes, it was. But in this case, you mentioned the expert consensus a moment ago, and I'm going to say something which, sticking my neck out, probably doesn't go along with the expert consensus on what's happening next in Ukraine. I don't think that invasion is actually likely. I think this is an enormous strategic bluff by Russia, which has been quite successful so far because it's brought the United States to the table to discuss the whole of the future security of Europe, something that shouldn't be discussing in the first place.
That's extraordinary. So Putin sort of flexing his muscles, suggesting that he might well grab more parts of Ukraine, because of course he has already, in effect, well, annexed a chunk of Ukraine. He did so in 2014. To what extent, then, is the West moving too close to Russia? What are we potentially giving guarantees to Russia about before any invasion's gone ahead?
Well, it's worth reading the whole text of these draft treaties that Russia has provided to the US and NATO, which effectively lay out its demands. Everybody's talking about this being about Ukraine not joining NATO, but that's just one aspect of it. There is so much more in those treaties that is not about security guarantees for Russia. It's about taking them away from everybody else. It is about rolling NATO back because Russia wants to go back in time to an era when it had control over the whole of Eastern Europe. It's about demilitarizing Eastern Europe, denuclearizing the whole continent so that the only forces that hold European capitals at risk are Russian ones, and the only nuclear missiles that can threaten them are Russian ones. Russia, in effect, wants to push NATO back in order that it can extend its own power. And that's the point that a lot of people are missing when they reduce this to just being about NATO expanding eastwards.
Are we falling into a trap here when we start talking about NATO and Russia as if these are these two great power blocks battling with each other, as if NATO is some sort of expansionary thing, when in reality it was those Eastern European countries that applied to join NATO, not NATO that was expanding into them, as Russia wishes to do on the other side? Are we falling into a bit of a trap then when we start talking in the language of NATO expanding or Russia expanding?
Well, unfortunately, that's not the only trap. The US has fallen into how Russia frames this entire conversation. Not only about the fact that, yes, the United States and Russia should be talking about the future of security of Eastern European countries without actually involving those countries. So it's like a conversation between the great powers over the heads of the people it actually affects. And of course, if you live in Eastern Europe, that has very uncomfortable echoes of the 20th century. But also this whole framing of the conversation, the fact that the Russians simply fail or refuse to understand that countries join NATO because they want to. Russia thinks it's like the old Warsaw Pact, where Moscow dragged these countries in against their will. In fact, you've seen President Putin early on in this crisis talking about NATO making dangerous attempts to seize Ukraine. That's a direct quote. They just cannot understand that the only reason these countries want to join NATO, is precisely because of Russia. And everything Russia does is counterproductive, because here they are mounting a military threat to try to stop other countries joining NATO, failing to realize that that's precisely the reason why they want to join NATO in the first place.
What an absolutely extraordinary time we're living through. It seems like we're sort of rerunning part of the 20th century, although I really do hope that some Western European powers sort of get on the front foot about this, because it does seem in particular that Germany is a little bit too in hoc to Putin. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're running low on time, but Keir Giles, expert in Russian power projection at Chatham House, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Well, finally in this programme, what a time for the Tory party to start attacking itself. This morning, a fresh inquiry has been established into the allegations of Islamophobia made by former Minister Nusrat Ghani. Over the weekend, a further no-confidence letter was sent in to Sir Graham Brady, this time submitted by Newcastle under Lyme MP Aaron Bell. And the Sue Gray report is expected likely towards the end of this week, although there are some suggestions we may have to wait 1 week more. The tension is palpable. Well, let's discuss all of this now with the Conservative commentator Alex Dean. Welcome to the programme, Alex. It was a very turbulent week last week for Boris Johnson. Sort of day by day, he seemed more safe and less safe, almost flipping by the hour. Can we expect something similar this week?
Thanks, Tom. Great to be with you. And may I just say how enlightening that interview you did about Ukraine was just now. It's exactly the kind of thing I watch GB News for. My view on the question you've asked me is this, that actually the Prime Minister is in a slightly stronger position than conventional wisdom might suggest. And the thing that's helped him most is the defection that we saw last week. Christian Wakeford, their Bury MP, going to the Labour benches. Politics is a tribal business. And the extent to which there was in-party bickering, by a significant extent, was, not completely, of course, but was to a significant degree brought back together in the face of a common enemy. And when people saw that defection happen, I thought that it was quite remarkable to see the way people roamed back behind the PM in a way they hadn't been before. And I saw two suggestions from Jonathan Gullis, one of the new intake MPs, that there might even have been a letter or two of no confidence withdrawn after that defection. So things don't, of course, only go one way. History shows us that it's quite a lot harder to get to the target number of letters that you need to the 1922 committee than people speculate about. And on your excellent point about timing, I note that Dominic Cummings is being interviewed by Sue Gray today. Cummings is, of course, never knowingly under-talked. He may take that session far longer than people are expecting. She may require him to appear before her a second time. Who knows? She's not got stated rules of procedure which tie her down to a stated timetable. She could well take this another week.
It's interesting, given that how much newspaper reports have been relying on those blogs of Dominic Cummings, that he's not been spoken to until this week, really quite late in the day. To me, that would potentially suggest that his account is not the sort of structure, is not the skeleton of this report.
That may be true. Of course, on the other hand, she's entitled to take into account his public writings, and he's set out at quite some length what he thinks already. So she might have a view that she's already got a good sense of the Cummings position. Unlike most participants, he's set out in a, paragraphs numbered one after another, exceptionally long set of thoughts on what happened in Downing Street when. So she may already think to herself that she's got an understanding of that. Of course, on the other hand, there may be some personal circumstances on Cummings' side, which means that it was better to appear before her later. But of course, we're talking about this as if it's, like a judge-led inquiry or tribunal. It doesn't have the same status or standing as that. And I think that the next stage of political argument we've got to prepare ourselves for, if Sue Gray basically acquits the PM, is people saying, well, this is a whitewash, it wasn't a proper procedure, because we didn't get the result from the inquiry that I wanted, we've now got to have another inquiry. And I think, the PM can almost never win this.
That's it. That's an extraordinary position because, of course, reading some commentators over the weekend, it seems as if the Prime Minister is not going to be Prime Minister by the end of this week. But you're saying that's less likely, and really we're going to get a bit of a procedural battle, potentially, upon the publication of this report.
That's right. I mean, I just can't see the way that you timing-wise, you can get the Gray report coming out and 54 letters of no confidence to Sir Graham Brady this week. It's just, I think, very, very unlikely as a proposition on the pragmatic timings. I know people are getting very excited, but history teaches us. I mean, Theresa May had this happen, and it took a great deal longer in her case. There's a leader that didn't command the same kind of public attention and hadn't won a significant majority at a general election. And even in her case, it took ages to get the letters of no confidence to Sir Graham Brady. So history teaches us this process takes quite a lot longer. We don't even know when Sue Gray is going to hand her report down. We don't know yet, as per Dominic Raab's remarks, how much of it we're going to see. Expect a sideshow argument about that as well, Tom. So I think Boris Johnson's going to be sitting quite a lot prettier than people are expecting for some time to come.
Well, let's keep our ears close to the floor on this. It's going to be a fascinating week, and I just wish that Sue Gray was a little bit more public with what the sort of timing was. But we'll be following this throughout the week. Alex Dean, for now, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Well, that's it for the show. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy. But first, here's the weather.
Well, zooming into southwest England, and a frost-free start, though rather grey and cloudy. Best chance of bright or sunny spells across North Devon. It'll be remaining dry with light winds.
Here's southeast England and East Anglia. It'll be a widely cloudy but dry day, feeling cold with a high around 5 degrees Celsius. Across